Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's June 26, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness.
First topic is the New York City mayoral Democratic primary race. First of all, congrats to Jeff for predicting that. A couple of nights before the election, Jeff's prediction didn't look like it was going out on a limb because the polls and the betting markets had swung wildly in Mamdani's favor. But when we made the prediction a week ago, that was not the case. And as we'll get into the course of this episode, I didn't follow the election, the primary, the campaigning at all. I did what I tend to do with political races. As we've discussed many times here, I am a polling respecter, and the polls clearly showed, up until the very last one, literally every single poll that was done except for the one on the eve of the election showed Cuomo with a sizable lead. And even though it had shrunk somewhat, the second to last poll had Cuomo winning by 10 points. And so as the dust settles, I have to reevaluate how much stake I put in the polling. This could be a true outlier, one that doesn't pretend for the value of polling going forward. And I think if that is the case, and maybe there'll be additional polling in the future that will shed light on this question, the major event that happened in between Cuomo's comfortable polling lead and Mamdani's surprise surge in the polls and even more surprising victory on election night was, of course, the United States bombing multiple Iranian military and nuclear sites. That happened earlier in the week that the U.S. bombing of Iran happened. There was a poll by economist YouGov asking respondents, all Americans, what percentages supported the United States becoming militarily involved in Israel's conflict with Iran, and it was just 16% of all Americans did, and among liberals, just 8% in the nationwide poll supported military action, the United States against Iran. And New York City's Democratic primary voters are probably more left-leaning than the average self-described liberal in a national poll from economist YouGov. So it's not implausible to imagine that the support for the position that Mamdani was most, as far as foreign policy was concerned, most strongly associated with in opposition to Israel, and correspondingly that Cuomo was most strongly associated with in favor of Israel and in favor of the United States joining Israel, that issue, less than 5% of primary voters were on Cuomo's side. And so for that to have happened just days before the actual voting, if there is a single incident that could explain why the polling was so incorrect, so off the mark, I don't know what else it could be. The Emerson poll, which was the one that showed Mamdani winning in the 8th round of ranked choice voting, even that was the big surprise poll that swung the betting markets in Mamdani's favor. Even that one had the first round of voting had Cuomo winning by 3 points, and ultimately in the first round of voting, Mamdani won by 7. So that poll, the one that was most favorable towards Mamdani, only was off by a factor of 10 points, where the race ended up settling. So even that one was way, way over optimistic of Cuomo's chances and way underestimating how well Mamdani would do. That poll had Cuomo beating Mamdani among Hispanics by 60% to 40% and among blacks by 62 to 38%. So close to a 2-to-1 edge among blacks and Hispanics for Cuomo. And that bore out in the borough results. Cuomo won handily the Bronx, which is the least white borough in New York City. He also won Staten Island, but that had a very small turnout, as that is the one borough that is majority Republican. Mamdani in that poll won among whites 61% to 39%, and that obscures the Jewish portion of the vote. Jews are racially coded almost exclusively as white, and this poll showed, or a previous poll the same week, where I was able to find information broken out by Jewish voters who comprise between 20 and 25% of the Democratic primary electorate in New York City were favoring Cuomo 2-1. So that meant that Mamdani, if you do a little back of the envelope calculation, that means that Mamdani won non-Jewish whites in New York City by somewhere between 3-1 or 4-1, and also won Asians 79% to 21%. So among non-Jewish whites and Asians, Mamdani won something like 4-1 over Cuomo, and Cuomo won 2-1 among blacks and Hispanics and Jews. Outside of the results and going over the on-the-ground demographic electoral numbers, the take-home analysis, the take-home message I have from this, and it is nuanced, so this may sound counterintuitive at first, and it may just be incorrect, but I don't think that it is especially surprising that someone who is foreign-born in a city that is now 40% foreign-born, that's important to understand. In a lot of ways, New York City is not really an American city. It is a foreign-born, cosmopolitan world city, and yet, despite the lessons that can be drawn and that are being drawn, especially on the right, among commentators who may not be able to really decipher some of the nuanced differences in the Democratic electorate, are treating this as, well, this is what happens when you bring in the third world and diversity occurs and you bring in all of these, implicitly all of these non-white voters. This is what you get. You get this non-white, young socialist guy who's foreign-born. And I don't necessarily think that any of that is incorrect, but at the same time, it raises the obvious question, if that is the case, then why was it whites who so overwhelmingly voted for Mamdani while Cuomo won among blacks and Hispanics and Jews, who probably comprise a larger, or are by rate more likely to be foreign-born than the whites in New York City are. Now, the Asian vote is a separate matter, but that's a relatively small percentage of the overall electorate.
The New York City Democratic white primary voters are a very specific subcategory of whites. First of all, New York City whites tend to be more liberal and hipster, and it attracts a certain kind of white person. And then that subcategory is further divided into, among that relatively liberal white population, the even more liberal ones who will take the trouble to vote in a Democratic primary. So I think that explains part of it.
Yes, that's an important point to keep in mind when we're talking about primaries. Even in a city like New York City that is overwhelmingly Democrat, still in this high-profile, nationally important primary election, the total turnout on the Democratic side was still less than 1 million people in a city of over 8 million. And Mamdani got a minority. He got a plurality, but he got a minority of that less than 1 million votes. So in a city of over 8 million, he received fewer than 500,000 votes to effectively become the mayor of the city. As we discussed last week, this, as far as its national salience is concerned, this primary election was in large part a referendum on the state of the Israel lobby influence in America post October 7th, after a year and a half of Israeli international or behavior that has been viewed internationally as rogue, violent, even criminal behavior by Israel. And despite AIPAC's and the ADL's best efforts and their dropping of much of what they focused on previously, notably the turning on South Africa and no longer talking about the dangers of apartheid. In fact, in Mamdani's victory speech, he talked about Nelson Mandela, which I thought was an interesting touch given the dynamic with regards to South Africa and apartheid and Israel and Palestine and what is going on there.
Yeah, a lot to say. For one thing, Mamdani's parents lived in Uganda before he was born. And when Idi Amin took power in the early 1970s, I certainly do not know all the details, but essentially Idi Amin took power and expelled many of the foreigners, including the Indians. So his Mamdani's parents were exiled from Uganda. So that just adds another interesting wrinkle to him referencing an African country. The issue of Israel came up many times during the New York Democratic primary, and the candidates at one of the Democratic debates were asked, which foreign country are you going to visit first once you become mayor? And I believe all of them except Mamdani said that they would visit Israel. Mamdani said, well, I'm not going anywhere. I'm running to be mayor of New York City. I'm going to stay here in New York City. I'm going to visit the Jewish, the synagogues, the temples. I'm going to address the issue of anti-Semitism. So a very smart answer, I think, that Mamdani gave. And obviously Andrew Cuomo has made a core part of his campaign that New York City needs to address this rise in anti-Semitism. And I don't have the polling to back this up, but it just feels like the Israeli brand, so to speak. So the support for Israel has taken the biggest hit I've ever seen in my lifetime since October 2023, after Israel's just relentless, savage bombing of Gaza. And it's just becoming increasingly obvious how brutal and barbaric that attack has been, I think, in the eyes of many, even in the eyes of people who are predisposed towards in favor of Israel. It's just a bridge too far for them, what Israel is doing and continues to do. I'm wondering how Eric Adams, the current mayor, the current black mayor of New York City, I wonder how he's viewing the results of this primary. My first thought would be he's probably happy. So Eric Adams is a Democrat, but he elected not to run in the Democratic primary. Instead, he's going to be running, we should say the general election is in November. Eric Adams is going to be running as an independent. I don't know exactly why he did that, but it's probably looking like a good decision because I don't think he would have won the primary. But now, of all the I would say if Eric Adams was asking himself who would I rather face, Cuomo or Mamdani, I would guess he's happy to face Mamdani. He thinks he has a better chance. All of the establishment Jewish money and support went to Cuomo. Now that Cuomo's out, they are kind of forced to go towards Adams. Adams is the only realistic barrier between Mamdani and Mamdani being the mayor of New York City. So I would think the establishment Jewish support's going to go towards Eric Adams, but that might be tricky because he's been savaged and Eric Adams has been criticized a lot since, I would say, like 2022 when he took a surprisingly hard stance against the illegal aliens flooding into New York City and his relative cooperation with the Trump administration. But as Ness pointed out, the establishment seemingly threw Andrew Cuomo kicked Andrew Cuomo to the curb back in 2021 when, of course, in Clown World, it wasn't that Cuomo sent elderly people testing positive to COVID to nursing homes, and probably his decision resulted in the needless deaths of thousands of elderly people in New York City. That's not what was beyond the pale for Andrew Cuomo. It was the sexual harassment allegations. That's what ultimately forced him to resign, and it seemed like he was done for, but the establishment rallied behind him again in 2024, 2025, so maybe they'll do the same thing with Eric Adams.
I think that the most likely that they will, in fact, do that, and it is a worthwhile reminder that the power structure is not omniscient or omnipotent or smooth operators all the time. This is going to be, as Jeff said, they unnecessarily, if they were able to read the tea leaves, they unnecessarily damaged Cuomo. It was them in discarding Cuomo in 2021 that made it more difficult for him to win in 2025. And this, like the difficulties with the reliability of polling, the questions that raises, this also raises for me the questions about how effective the corporate media structure is. in being able to rehabilitate those that it throws to the side, and then it dusts back off and presents again to the public. And they're going to have another go round at it with Eric Adams because they've trashed him for the better part of the last 3 years. And now they're going to try a similar routine that they did with Andrew Cuomo, where they try to rehabilitate Eric Adams, because the money, the power structure, the Israel lobby, a lot of, to the extent that it exists, Republican Party support, that's all going to unify behind Eric Adams. And after missing the mark on this one, I don't want to be overly confident about my ability to presage what is going to happen in November. And I probably should backtrack a little bit from what I said earlier when I insinuated that it was almost a fait accompli that Mamdani will win in November. That may not be the case. There is a betting market already open on the general election on Polymarket for November, and it has Mamdani at 75% and Eric Adams at 25%. So the smart money is on Mamdani right now, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that Eric Adams wins.
Who is Zohran Mamdani? So, as I mentioned earlier, his parents are both Indian descent, Muslim. I had no idea how, but they ended up in Uganda and working or doing something there. And then like I said, in the 70s, when Idi Amin took power, he kicked out the foreigners. So I think they were given Mamdani's. This was in the 70s. Mamdani wasn't born till the late 80s, early 90s. So this was before he was born, but his parents got refugee status in the UK, and then I think eventually they actually ended up back in Uganda, maybe after things had settled down. His father, Mahmoud Mamdani, is a fairly well-known academic. He's a post-colonial professor. Post-colonials, generally just white people suck, and they screwed everything up. And Zohran's mother is a filmmaker, and I didn't realize I've actually seen one of her movies, The Namesake. It was a pretty mainstream, crowd-pleasing movie about Indian immigrants in the United States. Came out about 20 years ago. So she's a fairly well-known filmmaker, and that makes more sense when you realize that she helped with her son's campaign, because it was a very slick campaign. He made lots of videos, and they're slick, well-produced. Obviously had somebody behind the camera who knew what they were doing, and presumably that was his mother. And speaking of his mother, back, I believe this was from 2013, it's from an article from the Hindustan Times, where she's quoted, Zohran's mother's quoted about her son. So this would have been when her son was in his 20s, I guess. She said, quote, "He is not an American at all. He was born in Uganda, raised between India and America. He is at home in many places. He thinks of himself as a Ugandan and as an Indian." And so I guess it's appropriate that he's now likely to be the mayor of the most populous American city. So what did Mamdani run on? What was his platform? Well, probably his biggest idea is to do a rent freeze on 43% of New York City's rental units. He wants to create some sort of office or commission to focus on LGBTQ rights and discrimination. He wants to create one or more city-owned grocery stores. He wants to protect gender-affirming care. He wants to raise the minimum wage to $30 per hour by 2030. And he also wants to end New York City's cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement. There's a quote from Milton Friedman. I don't know if I have it exactly right, but it's to the effect of, you can have either one, open borders, or number two, a welfare state, but you can't have both. And the reason behind that is, if you have open borders and people come in, it can perhaps work if you don't have a big social safety net for those people, so that anybody who comes in genuinely has to work, and because otherwise they won't eat. They'll starve. Or you can have a generous welfare state where the citizens of a country are given lots of benefits like health care and food and free housing and free school and all those things. But obviously the material materials are limited, so that system can't work if you just allow anyone in the world who wants to come in and instantly take part in the freebies. But Mamdani wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to end ICE cooperation, which presumably means, I wouldn't even say presumably, it has to mean that anybody from anywhere in the world, no matter how they are able to, if they are able to physically be present in New York City, they will be eligible for all of these welfare benefits. So any welfare benefits that exist, they will be increased under Mamdani, and then the eligibility will also be increased. So anyone in the world who makes it to New York City will be able to take part in all these programs that Mamdani wants to implement. And obviously that is just completely unrealistic and unsustainable. And Mamdani is currently in the state assembly. So he's in the member of the lower house of the New York State legislature. And this probably would have been when he was running, or maybe he was already in office. But back in 2020, actually, to be precise, November 5th, 2020, he made a comment, or he tweeted on a video of some LGBTQ protesters getting, roughed up by the police. I don't know the details of what was going on, but they were doing it near the Stonewall Inn, which was is considered there was a riot there in 1969, and that's considered the start of the modern gay rights movement. So there was something to do. They were near Stonewall, and there was a riot of some kind. The police were roughing up the protesters. Mamdani made a tweet, commented on that, and he said, quote, "Queer liberation means defund the police." So I think he toned down the radicalism a little bit for this Democratic primary, but presumably he still believes that kind of thing. So I think that kind of gives you a taste of what New York City can expect if he becomes mayor.
I won't pretend to have done a deep dive on this guy's history, but in 2021, that wasn't especially radical, particularly viewed in context of the cultural ascendancy of the left at the time, and as a member of the Democratic Party in a urban area, that did not sound radically out of place. I wonder how much. So his parents, his family, coming as what Amy Chua would call market dominant minority status in Africa, and that is a pattern that also played out not just in Uganda, but also in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, where there is a significant and very wealthy subcontinental population that act as middlemen between producers from outside of the continent and the local African population. And oftentimes, especially when there is an economic downturn, the subcontinentals are on the losing end of populist, xenophobic energy. And what that does over time is they develop the ability to suss out the cultural landscape and act accordingly. And so I'm not qualified to say whether or not Mamdani is a true believer in this sort of soft social democratic politics, or if he is someone who has very effectively, much in the same way that AOC did in unseating Joe Crowley, has been able to read the cultural room very well and adapt accordingly. And that was what I was getting at when I was talking about how, as the country has changed so much culturally and demographically, among other things, over the last 2 generations, that even though the country is less white, it is not that hard to understand why the cultural vanguard of the changing cultural norms, which are often status-conscious white hipster types, people we would refer to as stuff white people like, or swipples in the past, that they are on the leading edge of that cultural change, while non-whites like blacks and Hispanics, somewhat paradoxically, at least at first blush, often end up being the more conservative end of the party, of the progressive political party. And it looks like how this primary played out, that's a perfect illustration of that phenomenon. Jeff and I had talked before we started recording. Jeff had mentioned that Eric Adams had called Mamdani a snake oil salesman, and I think the way the Adams angle that plays into that and is related to what I've been talking about here, where I could see Eric Adams, his campaign, his approach being that, hey, I'm the real New Yorker. I have the New Yorker accent. I have a name that's recognizable. You know who I am. This guy, this Mamdani, is a carpetbagger. His family has a history of coming to a place that they don't belong and trying to take control of things and then getting run out of town. And that's what they're trying to do here. A lot of this will be implicit. Certainly, Adams himself won't say it, but I could imagine surrogates implying this and Adams himself implying as much.
So Eric Adams, as I said, is running as an independent, and one of his key planks is, quote, stop anti-Semitism. So that's I think he's going to lean heavily on that. So Mamdani has refused to condemn the phrase globalize the intifada. He says, probably rightfully, that intifada just means struggle in Arabic and that it doesn't necessarily mean violence and that it has been misconstrued by English speakers. But regardless, I think that's a tact that Eric Adams will take. Mamdani was also asked, interestingly, whether he believes that Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state. And his answer was something like, I believe Israel has the right to exist. And the follow-up was, do you believe it has the right to exist as a Jewish state? And I don't know if he said no, but his obvious implication was no, it doesn't, because it's an apartheid state. It has the right to exist, but it can't exist as a Jewish supremacist state, which is what it is.
Jeff mentioning that makes me feel compelled to underscore again how the primary and the general election as well will really be a referendum or a look into the sort of a physical evaluating the health of AIPAC and the power of the Israeli Jewish lobby in the United States. New York City is 12% Jewish. That is in a city of over 8 million. So there are about 1 million Jews living in New York City. It is the largest concentrated Jewish population in the world outside of Israel itself. And so if the Israel lobby is not able to secure a victory in New York City for the pro-Israel side against someone who is quite explicitly anti-Israel, at least opposed to Israel's actions over the last couple of years, it's difficult to see how it doesn't reveal a real sea change in the political landscape in the United States. Support for Israel had been a bipartisan issue in American politics since the 40s and really since the 60s. But the fallout from October 7th, 2023 has changed that, perhaps irrevocably. It has become a partisan issue. We looked at polling a year and a half ago and noted while Democrats were more critical of Israel than Republicans were, still a plurality of Democrats, when asked if their sympathies lied more with the Israelis or the Palestinians, by about a 2-to-1 margin, Democrats said with the Israelis, and that has flipped now. YouGov ran a poll on June 24th, so just a few days ago, asking respondents if their sympathies were more with Israelis or with Palestinians. And this is a question they've been asking for years. As I noted, a year and a half ago, Democrats were 2-to-1 in favor of Israelis. Now it is 33% the Palestinians, 14% the Israelis. So by a more than 2-to-1 margin, now Democrats say their sympathies lie more with Palestinians than with Israelis. When it comes to Republicans, however, it's 61% with Israelis and just 4% with Palestinians. So by about a 12 to 1, more than a 12 to 1, more like a 15 to 1 margin. Republicans sympathize more with the Israelis than the Palestinians. And so this issue that had been historically bipartisan is now increasingly becoming one that has a very strong partisan affiliation attached to it in the United States. And as far as how that plays out, it'll be interesting to see. Does that mean that the corporate media structure, so much of which is difficult to separate from AIPAC and support for Israel in the Middle East, is that going to mean that there's going to be some sort of cultural ascendancy for the Republican Party? Or does that just mean that progressivism and leftism and what is by default the cultural zeitgeist, is that going to be one that is inherently anti-Israel?
So, Ness, how would you answer that poll question? In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are your sympathies more with the Israelis, the Palestinians, about equal, or not sure?
That's tough. And at the risk of sounding pretentious, and I don't mean to be, this really is a nuanced question that's difficult to give a single poll response to. And I hate saying that. I say just answer the poll question. It's not that complicated of one. But in this case, it really is, for me, as a heritage American, as an American nationalist, and even more of a localist than that, but as someone who is concerned about culture and language and borders and race and all of these things, the preservation of the West and its ancestral homelands and its diaspora, the somewhat brutal reality is the only Western country, if we grant Israel Western status, that is, one, has an above replacement fertility, and two, is expanding its territory, and three, is on the assertive, taking bold actions against perceived enemies. The one country that's doing that is Israel, unique to the rest of the Western world. In a neoliberal open borders world where labor and capital and populations can move freely around and there are differential fertility rates, the reality is that people of European descent will continue to diminish and ultimately disappear if they don't assert themselves, at least going some way in the direction of Israel. We've mentioned how border crossings have dropped significantly with the incoming second Trump administration. Well, if we had a militarized border with Latin America that was comparable to the border that Israel had with the Arab world, and if additionally those inside of the United States that were not part of the United States, that were not legally allowed to be here, and that were not culturally and ethnically and religiously American, however we want to define that, if they were forcibly removed and their lives, they were treated as second-class citizens, so that if they weren't involuntarily removed, then they had a strong incentive to voluntarily remove themselves. Well, that seems to be the formula for demographic and cultural continuity. And Israel's version of it is really brutal and shocking, and it is hard to shake the feeling that I am on the edge of justifying the atrocities that have occurred against the Palestinians. And that's why I can't answer this definitively in favor of the Israelis. And while my human instincts, I'm a father myself, and seeing children being blown up or being orphaned or cradling the bodies of their siblings is soul crushing. It's disgusting and it's brutal and it hurts to see. And yet, if that is, I don't know what the middle ground is between these two things. And ultimately, if it's my kids or their kids, I'm coming down on the side of my kids, I think. So I would have to, weighing those two things, going back and forth, but also realizing that, well, Israel maybe is in some way a Western. The Israelis are not Middle Americans, and I do not think that that ports perfectly. I just think that the Israelis have more in common with Middle American Northwestern European descended Christians or cultural Christians living in the Midwest than the Palestinians do, but it's not so strong that it's a perfect overlap. And so I would either answer about equal, or probably, if I want to be honest, I would probably answer not sure, which is about what 1/4 of the respondents here answered. What about you?
I'm a little less nuanced. I would say the Palestinians, and I should caveat that by saying by no means do I want the Palestinians to arrive or to be settled in the United States. I think if they came here in any significant number, that would be a huge detriment to the United States for a variety of reasons. So I have to acknowledge that up front, but just on a basic human level, I just think it's absolutely appalling what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. The latest atrocity in a long, long line of atrocities is this farce of aid distribution, where it really just appears that the Israelis are just dangling this food and aid in front of a starving population. And in many cases, when this starving population approaches to try to get a little bit of food and basic materials, the Israeli IDF just opens fire on them and kills them. You just hear every day there's just tens or sometimes hundreds of Palestinians just gunned down by the Israelis, and it's just absolutely appalling. And you have people in the government, like the Treasury Minister Smotrich, saying that the Palestinian lands belong to Israel and that the Palestinians need to be removed from the land. So, I mean, it's just if it's not genocide, it's clearly a campaign of ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, I am a proud American, and I take tremendous pride in the heritage of this country, of what the European Americans were able to accomplish in terms of settling the continent, manifest destiny. And it's hard not to view essential component of that as, if not genocide of the Native Americans, certainly ethnic cleansing. And the fact is, when the Europeans arrived on the continent of North America, that was a disaster for the indigenous population. And so it's not terribly different than what the Israelis are doing. So perhaps it opens me up to inconsistency if I, on the one hand, praise what my ancestors did on the continent of North America while condemning Israelis who are perhaps doing something comparable. But at the end of the day, not thinking too hard about this question, my gut reaction is to say my sympathies are with the Palestinians.
To be more pithy, yes, I would say my heart is with the Palestinians. My head is more conflicted. And as you alluded to there is the big problem of where did the Palestinians go? Because another harsh reality here is that the surrounding Arab states do not want these people at all. Egypt doesn't want them. Jordan doesn't want them. Saudi Arabia doesn't want them. The human capital in Gaza is quite low. People who have anything on the ball and have resources have left over the last generation. And so these are largely welfare cases. And part of the reason that my head is conflicted is because, as Jeff also alluded to there, with none of the Arab world wanting to take these people, and Israel, of course, ethnically cleansing them to no longer keep them in a state of quasi-incarceration in sort of an open-air prison, with the Israelis wanting to push them out and no one else in the region wanting to take them. Well, what has historically been the case over the last 60 or 70 years, whenever there is a population somewhere in the world that no one else wants to take, well, they go to white countries. Invariably, they end up going to white countries. It's Asia for Asians, Africa for Africans, even Israel for Jews, but never whites for white countries, Europeans for European countries and European diasporas. It's white and European countries for everyone. Before we close things off, I want to briefly move from what I was happy to be incorrect about, because I think that Mamdani replacing Cuomo and the old Democratic Party establishment, replacing that is something that has to happen. It is a necessary chapter in the novel that is American history and how it is going to play out. This was going to happen. I didn't think it would happen as soon as it did, but it seems inevitable given demographic trends. So while I did not predict it, I am glad that it happened. However, I would have been very unhappy if I had been incorrect about how the conflict between Israel and Iran has played out over the last week. And effectively, that has been Iran stopping, putting the brakes on, and not climbing up the escalatory ladder any further. Despite the assurances of many in the alternative media, people like Scott Ritter come to mind that Iran was poised to wipe the floor with Israel and that there would be bombs going off in Tel Aviv, and that this was something where Netanyahu clearly had bitten off more than he could chew, and that the Iron Dome didn't work and nothing was going to protect. Hell being visited on Israel with Iran's counterstrike. Despite those assurances, nothing of the sort happened. There is some copium now about how Iran voluntarily held back and projected ahead of time what strikes they were going to make, and they allowed American military to evacuate so that there was just cosmetic damage done and there was no casualties on the American side. And so it permitted a de-escalation that Iran just sort of magnanimously did that, even though they could have really given Israel the what for and debilitated Israel's military capabilities. That seems to me to be just what I called it obvious copium. It's just not the case. Iran is a hollowed out state. It was not an aberration that the group that they funded, Hezbollah in Syria, melted away immediately, and that their proxy that was built up as this force that was more advanced and powerful than the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, that was all nonsense. And instead what we have with Iran is what we probably should expect from a country where the consanguinity rate is 40% and the mean measured average IQ is in the low 90s, and the country is a theocracy and it has been subject to harsh sanctions for decades. That all of these things combined have given us a country that is not very militarily capable. And the reason that I'm so happy that appears to be playing out is because if Iran were able to effectively strike Israel, does anyone at this point think, given what Israel has shown it is willing to do in defiance of international expectations and perceived international norms, that Israel, if it felt like it was genuinely existentially threatened, and it feels like it already does, even with Iran not being able to do anything effective, if Iran really was raining hell down on Tel Aviv, does anyone think that Israel would not respond with a nuclear weapon or a set of nuclear strikes on Iran? And that would be far, far worse than what we have right now. I am forced to admit that is on a short-term time frame, because I don't see where we get an equilibrium point that is stable, because whatever the veracity of Iran's intention to acquire nuclear weapons is, they've never been more incentivized to get them than they are now, with the United States bombing nuclear facilities and Israel launching strikes, assassinating leaders, assassinating high-profile human resources without much retaliation at all. The Scott Ritters of the world will say that Iran is demonstrating a remarkable amount of restraint, but it could also be that Iran simply doesn't have any other options, because, as we talked about previously, what is the end game if Israel strikes Iran conventionally and Iran responds with conventional military response and gets the better of Israel in that conventional military response? Israel's a small country with 8 million people crammed into a place that's the size of New Jersey. And so if there is conventional warfare that looks like Gaza has looked like in the last year and a half, what is Israel's only response? Well, there are two responses. One, the United States joins on the side of Israel and launches a conventional war to put Iran down, and that is, other than nuclear Armageddon, that is like the ultimate disaster scenario. And yet the only other scenario besides America responding with conventional military power is nuclear escalation. Because, at the risk of repeating myself, is there anything in the last year and a half or the last 20 or 30 or 50 years, depending on who you talk to, that would lead to a conclusion that there is any country other than Israel that is the most likely country to use nuclear weapons now? You could say, well, maybe Russia, or maybe Pakistan if India was aggressive towards them, or maybe India if Pakistan was aggressive towards them. But the through line in all of this is nuclear powers that feel like they have no other option are going to use those nuclear weapons against conventional military existential forces, existential threats. If a firearm is the great equalizer in a barroom brawl, well, having nuclear weapons is the great equalizer when it comes to nation states. And a state like Iran that has done just about everything that it could be expected to do, given all the humiliations that it suffered and the isolation that it suffered, that in spite of all of this, it still has not credibly attained nuclear weapons, and yet it has Israel just braying to obliterate it. Well, what other option does Iran feel like it's going to have other than acquire nuclear weapons?
Given the escalation over the last few weeks, I'm happy that World War III seems to have been averted and that things seem to be calming down, and apparently Iran is willing to come back to the negotiating table, and hopefully some sort of equilibrium can be reached and things can calm down in the Middle East. So I'm happy about that. As we're recording this today, there's a lot of back and forth on the exact effects or devastation of the strikes that Trump ordered on Saturday. Trump, of course, in his bombastic way, said that the strike was a complete success, that it completely obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. Now there's some pushback on that from his own administration, preliminary reports saying that maybe the capabilities were degraded and that Iran might still possess some enriched uranium of some kind. So it remains to be seen how effective those strikes were. But again, it seems like things are calming down and that they don't appear to be escalating. So I consider that a great thing. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk with you next time.